Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings is the latest MCU film to hit theaters, and theaters only, not a theaters and Disney Plus thing like Black Widow did. Even though that movie still made a ton of money, they're just doing theaters this time. So we'll see how that turns out because, box office has been kind of dipping. Some movies doing pretty good, some not. We'll see how Shang-Chi does. I'm hoping for the best. But this movie follows Shang-Chi, played by Simu Liu, who is raised by his father, the Mandarin, or in this case, his name is Wenwu, the leader of this organization, the Ten Rings. He trained him all of his life growing up to be a badass martial artist fighter who can't be killed by anyone, and Shang-Chi eventually managed to escape and be, on his own for about 10 years or so, but now his father is trying to get the family, him and his sister, back together for something important, and he might have to stop that. I was really interested in this movie because we're in this point in the MCU where, we just had the biggest event of all time, Avengers Endgame, which was really epic and was really satisfying, concluding some of the characters we've seen and even introducing new paths for characters that we've seen before. But it was also like, okay, we've seen one of the biggest things ever. What else can we do to, spice it up, mix it up a bit? What else can we do? So when I heard they were going to do Shang-Chi, which is like a guy, from what I understand, has little to no superpowers. He's just kind of like an incredible martial artist. I was like, okay, I'm excited to see that, I'm excited to see what they can do with that, especially getting the director, Destin Daniel Cretton, who made some movies I really enjoy, like Short Term 12 and Just Mercy, two really strong, really good movies. So him being attached to this was really interesting. I was excited to see what they could do, especially since, MCU movies definitely are very action-packed and every director brings their own thing to it, but this has got to be very specific, martial arts stuff. You can't just kind of do it in the typical MCU style that a lot of directors, or at least the second unit directors that film these action sequences, tend to stick to. And right off the bat, this is one of the most entertaining MCU movies just by action sequences alone. Early on, when it's just kind of the more smaller hand-to-hand fights, ducking and weaving, it was moving so quickly. It borders on being almost incomprehensible just because of how fast everyone is going, but you're still locked in, you're still thoroughly engaged, and you can see what's happening. It's the fact that, you can see what's happening that's making you so clenched up, because I was thoroughly kind of clenched in my seat during a lot of times in this movie whenever action was taking place, because just the pure skill on display from every stunt person, every actor, involved in these action sequences, it's impressive as all get out. They just did some really impressive stuff, especially considering some of the locations where these fight sequences take place in, like, on a bus earlier on. It's like, okay, limited space, Bob Odenkirk just beat some people up on a bus, but that was mostly, that sequence was really impressive just because he managed to beat them up so well, even though he's like, a middle-aged dad. This is like, you have to do these martial arts moves on here, how's this gonna work? And they've managed to find a way, especially with this guy that has like a CGI sword on his hand, slicing things up. It was quite intense, and I loved every second of it. But then you have another scene where, like, they're on the side of a building, grappling onto, like, this construction stuff, trying to get to another place to avoid enemies, but Shang-Chi's gotta fight them still. It's really great stuff. There's, like, a chase moment as well, where someone's, like, running incredibly fast. They do, like, a little slide down onto another platform, only to get tackled. Oh my god. There's just so many great action sequences, even to the point where, when the third act stuff happens, and yes, in most MCU movies, the third act typically divulges into, like, big CGI fest, stuff is happening all over the place, and you gotta track multiple different characters. This stuff is very typical with MCU movies. It's not something I'm really knocking the movie for, because it's kind of like, whatever, that's part of the story you're telling, it's fine. But with this movie, even with all of the CGI stuff that they have to put in, and, the more over-the-top nature of it, some of the amazing choreography still stands out. The choreography with the CGI looks incredible. You can kind of buy into, like, okay, they're doing, like, some martial arts stuff that's a little more fantastical, but that's totally fine because this is the MCU. I'm totally all for it, and it's still really entertaining. It helps that, you care about the stuff that's actually going on, like, you understand the stakes, you understand what the problem is at one point without going too much into it. You're like, okay, I can see why they'd be in a total pickle with a lot of this stuff, so that was really engaging. Destin Daniel Cretton directed the hell out of this movie. He and the team did a really fantastic job just putting their all into this. Everything looked fantastic, the cinematography, excellent. The set design, the lighting, the musical score is wonderful to listen to. It accompanies the movie so well. Everything down to like the practical set design and the costume designs, to the other end of the visual effects and the designs for a lot of creatures that you get to see as the movie progresses and you get to experience this new place that you're in. It's all fantastic, you know? So yeah, even though they do put in a little bit more, like the movie starts off fairly grounded, all things considered, as far as like the martial arts fights go, and then it gets a little bigger and bigger. Still, you know, I was thoroughly engaged just because Destin Daniel Cretton was making a really, really great movie here. Every single thing on a technical level was really working for me, and I was really engaged. But it also helps that I was thoroughly engaged with the story too. This isn't one of those movies where I'm like, yeah, it's really well made and, you know, it has some really fun action sequences. Oh, but the story though. No, the story was actually really top notch, all things considered. First, I want to mention the chemistry between Simu Liu and Awkwafina was really good. I really like these two characters, Katie and Shang-Chi, interacting together, because Shang-Chi is the kind of character who, as I mentioned before, has had a really tough upbringing at a certain point because of the overbearing nature of his father, who's like this really cruel, nasty guy, and he's kind of had this chance to finally be free of those clutches at some point, but it's kind of left him kind of aimless, not really sure what to do, especially since he's trying to keep a low profile. And then you match that up with Katie, who's just an American girl, not tied to anything Ten Rings related at all, who is also kind of our guide as she experiences these things and reacts in realistic ways. But she is just kind of like, I'm just trying to find something to be passionate about, trying to find my purpose, kind of, you know. So these two kind of found each other, because of that, and they bonded over that. Those two characters are really fun to watch. They have really good chemistry, and you really like them as characters because their stories are so interesting, and they're kind of relatable too. You can kind of relate to at least aspects of these characters and also the performances. Even Shang-Chi, when, you know, he's fighting and he's doing these incredible things, he has like this, you know, the actor does like a really great job of acting like he's legitimately kind of bewildered and doesn't know what's going on while still looking badass, if that made any sense. But he's just so talented. He's a really great find. I'm not familiar with him. I don't know if I've ever seen him in anything before, but he's a really great find for this character because he's a legitimate movie star. You know, I could see that definitely happening. He's got the charisma. He's got the skill. Xiangling, who is Shang-Chi's sister, is in this movie, and she I found to be an interesting character as well because she wasn't necessarily on the same bad childhood path as Shang-Chi, but it was bad for different reasons, and it kind of led her to this point that's like completely opposite of him, you know, and it speaks a lot to her as a character. And at a certain point near the end of the movie, I won't spoil it, I was kind of like, you know what, that totally is in line with the character, and I also really enjoy this character. She's a badass, she can hold her own, she can beat up Shang-Chi, you know, so that was a really fun addition to have this kind of family dynamic of them all getting back together after several years. They all kind of have their past trauma. This movie ultimately is kind of about how a family was destroyed because of grief and because of trauma. That's pretty much how you would sum up Wenwu as a character played by Tony Leung, who is, by the way, one of the best villains the MCU has had. I know lately it's kind of been like, well, yeah, the MCU has kind of had some pretty good villains, like when you have the Spider-Man movies and also Thanos recently, Killmonger, but there still are a bunch of MCU villains who are kind of like, okay, not the best, or I don't know how to feel about this writing here. But Tony Leung as the real Mandarin this time around, not the Iron Man 3 switcheroo, which still works for the context of that movie, but still, he is fantastic here. And it's a lot because of the performance. He's smooth. He's not a yelling, screaming over the top villain. He's just a very, hey, whatever's going to happen is going to happen because I am in complete control right now. You know, he's that kind of threatening that I think he nails. The performance here is quite excellent, but he's a character that you can feel for. You know, you are kind of introduced knowing like, okay, he's kind of this type of character, but then it gets to a point in the backstory where you're like, oh, well, all right, I can see that happening for sure, yeah, and you kind of start to feel for him, and you have to quickly remind yourself, oh wait, he's the villain, and he's doing some bad stuff still. So I really enjoyed this story, mostly because it actually has something it wants to say, it has something it wants to be about, and it not only includes the hero, it's not just about selling you on this hero who is about to be in more Marvel movies, it's not just about, you know, giving you the origin of that, it's also trying to tell this story, with these two characters, the hero and the villain, properly fleshing the villain out so that you're actually kind of conflicted when fights happen and you actually do feel kind of bad because all things considered, he might not have been this evil before, and you kind of do feel really bad for the guy. I do have like two issues with this movie. One of them is just, sometimes there are some lines of comedy where I was like, not the best. It's not the strongest piece of work that we've got here. The MCU movies and even shows, they're comedies, they got their sci-fi and their action stuff, but comedy is consistent throughout all of them pretty much. So every once in a while you're bound to stick on some humor that's like, not my favorite thing in the world, but mostly this movie is pretty funny, especially as the movie goes on and they introduce some other characters that provide comedic relief, or the Awkwafina gets stronger with her delivery. And the last thing I'll say is that there's just a couple parts that I was wondering about. Like, after the movie ended, I was like, I really don't feel like I got the strongest grasp on why this was happening to begin with right here, or what was actually going on with this. I could have used something a little clearer, and maybe this is something that'll be resolved on a rewatch. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I really enjoyed this movie. I thought it was really great. It's definitely like, I think I added it to my Letterboxd list. I think it's in like my top 10 as far as like the MCU movies go, well deserved, because this is definitely a really strong outing. Destin Daniel Cretton, I hope he sticks around for like more Shang-Chi. I can't wait to see Simu Liu play this character more and interact with, some of the other Avengers if they ever get the chance to do that. I'm just really excited to see where else this character and the world that they've kind of introduced with that character can go, because this is really fresh and really exciting. You have all this, multiverse, cosmic stuff going on, and then you have this little patch of it that's like, oh, this is also really exciting and interesting. I'm gonna give Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings an A-. I had a blast with this movie. It was so much fun to watch. Simu Liu absolutely kills it as the character. Tony Leung kills it as the Mandarin, Wenwu. There's just so much to really enjoy about this movie, and there's surprisingly some things that I don't want to necessarily ruin, because there is some good surprises here. So I'll leave it at that. I just had a really great time with this. Check it out in the theater if you feel safe to, but it is so worth it, seeing it on that big screen, these fight scenes going on, and the sound design is kicked up. It's like, oh my gosh, this is incredible stuff. But if you've seen Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, leave in the comments below what you thought of it, and as always, thank you guys for watching. Make sure to subscribe. I'm Jackson Fulcher. See you guys next time.